We've learnt a lot about how the nervous system works, but we're now going to look at when things go wrong. Because as with every part of an animal, things can not work properly, there can be diseases and other problems. And when it comes to the nervous system, they can really affect people's lives. So damage to the nervous system affects people's lives. That's the main thing to think about in this video. So we're going to start by looking at 3 different people that you might know who've had nervous system damage and how it's affected their lives, but what they've been able to achieve afterwards as well, after their injuries. The first one here is Dylan Olcott. He suffered an injury where he couldn't use his legs and he's confined to a wheelchair, but he's been to the Olympics to play basketball and tennis, and he's also won 6 Grand Slams in tennis as well. So the details of his injury were he actually had a tumour in his spine that had to be cut out, and that meant that he couldn't use his legs, and we call that becoming a paraplegic. But he's made the most of that illness and he's succeeded in his sport career so far. He's also a host on Triple J, you might have heard him on the weekends. The next person here, she's another sports person. This is Louise Savage. And she was actually born with spinal damage. A defect, we call it, where she could barely use her legs. Not well enough to walk anyway. But using a wheelchair, she managed to train enough to go to the Paralympics, and she won 9 gold medals in the athletics. 9 gold medals at the Paralympics. I think she's our most successful sports person at the Paralympic Games ever. The last person here, this is Curtis Mayfield. Anyone who likes music might have heard of him. He died in the 90s, but he was a really important songwriter in America, particularly in the civil rights movement, talking about African American rights. So he was a songwriter. He actually was injured on stage when a whole lot of stage lighting fell on him and injured his spine. And he lost movement in his legs and arms, which is called becoming a quadriplegic. But he continued recording even after that injury for the rest of his life. Continued recording music after that. So we can see all of these people have had some kind of spinal damage or a spinal cord injury is the proper name. And it usually leads to not being able to use your legs or possibly arms as well. Looking at this diagram here on the side, this explains how spinal cord injuries can work. We can see the coloured regions of our legs, like the blue and the green. These relate to parts of the spine. So if a person is injured up here on the spine, maybe in an accident, or they're born with a defect, then they have a loss of function of all the body parts below that part of the spine. Loss of function. So they can't use any body parts below that, which means this person here, they would have no use of anything from the yellow down. So all their legs. This person would be a paraplegic if they had that spinal injury. There are also another group of diseases that we call degenerative diseases. Degenerative disease. And degenerate means to break down. So these diseases involve the myelin sheath on the nerve cells. Remember, the myelin is important for protecting the axon and making sure that the message gets passed down a nerve. The myelin sheath becomes damaged. Myelin is damaged, and this can cause a lot of different symptoms, and there are quite a few diseases that involve this kind of damage. The main consequence is that the messages sent from the brain, they slow down or they stop completely. Here's one person that you might know who had a degenerative disease. This is Stephen Hawking. He was a scientist and he lived until only a couple of years ago. But he did a lot of work in physics and really complicated science. He had one of these degenerative diseases and he couldn't talk, he couldn't walk, couldn't use his arms, he was in a wheelchair, but he still was able to live for 50 years and keep working in science for that time. And he wrote lots of books. He's one of the most famous people with these kind of diseases.